Hey, Prime members! Are you tired of ads interfering with your favorite podcasts? Good news! With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free podcasts. That's amazon.com/ad-free podcasts to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Welcome to Radical Personal Finance, a show dedicated to providing you with the knowledge, skills, insight, and encouragement you need to live a rich and meaningful life now while building a plan for financial freedom in 10 years or less. My name is Joshua Sheets. I am your host, and here during the month of March, I am continuing to promote some of the speakers who are gathering with me in April at the second annual Radical Personal Finance Family Camp. Now, that camp is completely sold out at this point, so thank you for those of you who are coming. I hope that you'll enjoy still, however, hearing some of the speakers that we are inviting and we'll be hearing from at Family Camp, and I hope that you'll join me in 2026 if you weren't able to get your tickets in time. My speaker today that I'm thrilled to welcome to Radical Personal Finance for an interview is Gregory Treat. Greg is a lawyer in the state of Texas who specializes in working with families and doing dynasty planning. And since the theme of this year's camp is community and dynasty, I wanted to invite Greg to help us not only cast a vision and think about what can be done, but also to understand some of the practical tools of intergenerational dynasty planning with regard to wealth and business. Gregory, welcome to Radical Personal Finance. I'm grateful that you're here with me.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I'm glad to be here.
So I'd like to begin by just hearing a little bit of your story and how you became interested in some of these areas of planning. What sparked this interest for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, I was born, this story actually goes all the way back to birth for me. So I was born into a multi-generational dairy farm family in Northern California in the late 80s. And if you know anything about the politics of California these past 30, 40 years, being a small family ag operation in California was not a great strategic position, you might say. So my family had been there. Like I said, I was a fourth generation. So my grandfather used to say, we've been here for 4 generations, bred, born, bled, and died here. And well, you know, I didn't wind up dying there as the way the story goes. But I grew up in the remnants of this incredible multi-generational edifice that my great grandmother in particular had built. So in the middle of our 360 odd acre ranch, there was the house, the big farmhouse. And there was about 6 acres of lawn right around the farmhouse. We might call this the inner manor. That's not what my family called it, but it'll kind of give you a picture for what was going on there. And then outside of that 6 acres was another ring of 6 to 12 acres that had the hands houses on the north side, the farm hands houses, and then it had the barn on the east side, and then the shop and some other animal pens on the south side. And the foreman's house, to give you an idea how specific this was, the foreman's house was literally half in and half out of the inner manor. So there was this physical representation built into the architecture of the housing of the org chart, you might say, right? His position as a foreman was exemplified in the architecture. So I grew up, my great grandmother had a family library that she had put together before she died. And basically what she did was when she got too old to climb stairs, they built her a ground floor apartment. And she covered the entire thing with bookshelves and had books and all of that. And I remember reading her copy of Xenophon's Economics. Another way to translate with that would be Xenophon's Household Management. Xenophon was a Greek philosopher, a contemporary of Socrates, back 2,500 years ago. And he wrote a book. This is a pretty short book. It's on how to manage a Greek household, okay, 4th century BC. And my grandmother had written notes in the margins. And to sum up her notes, she thought that Xenophon was a smart guy. He got almost everything right. But we had learned some things between Xenophon and the present. And she really did believe fundamentally that she was playing the same game, using the same techniques, using the same management strategy, you might say, in her farm, right? Her multi-generational dairy farm that she was building in the early 20th century, as Xenophon had used, over two millennium earlier. Okay? So I grew up with just this incredible richness of an awareness. And when I talk about multi-generational family and dynasty and things like that, for me, it's not some foreign, impossible thing that I've just read about in books. I think for a lot of people, and obviously I love books. It's great to know that stuff. But there's a lot of folks that they really have just kind of this lingering suspicion that really maybe human nature has changed or something, right? That for whatever reason, what was possible then in terms of having kids that share your values and being able to pass on not just money, but positions and land and the responsibilities to your community to go along with that for some reason, something changed in the water or the air, maybe in the last century or so. And people really struggle with that. Well, for me, I grew up watching those systems work. Now, they couldn't compete with a, frankly, tyrannical democratic consensus in California that basically took the land away from us by inches for most of my childhood. And we wound up losing the land when I was 17 years old. But I didn't see that system fail for lack of virtue. I saw that system crushed by an outside force. Does that make sense?
It does. Could you describe, because clearly this was a transformative event in your life, and yet This is something that we often allege happens, but we don't understand exactly how it happens. So what was the mechanism, the legal mechanisms? What were the taxes? What were the levers that resulted in your family losing your land?
Yeah, I mean, it was just there was lots and lots. There's almost an infinite number of ways for a modern industrial state to target a small business, right? They can do surprise inspections. They can levy, additional fees on the necessary chemicals. They can just accuse you of, not doing health inspections, right? And there's different ways. The level of prosecutorial discretion in all of these things is so incredibly vast that when a local establishment kind of decides that they want you gone, it's a death by 1,000 cuts, right? They couldn't actually just send an order. It wasn't a communist country. They send an order. Your ranch is now closed down, right? But they could do a bunch of little things that cumulatively, surprise inspections, because, we think about a surprise inspection, you have to stop working, right? And it's not an office job. There's actual animals, there's machines that have to be maintained. If you stop working to deal with this government official for a day or two, stuff doesn't get done, right? And when stuff doesn't get done, then you can very quickly get to the point where you're not making money this month or maybe even this year, right? If that happens a couple years in a row, then you're not able. And my grandfather, I love my grandfather, have incredible respect for him, but he made some strategic mistakes. So one of those was, I think, just not understand the big picture mistake that he made was not understanding the structural changes that had happened in our local community in the late 80s. Like it went from being an ag dominated town to a overwhelmingly urban and suburban town in less than 10 years. It was a very, very quick transition. And when that new county board of supervisors came in, they were very unhappy with the remaining farms and just found a bunch of different ways to express their displeasure. And one of the years, I was a small child at this time, would have been less, younger than 6 years old, so I don't know the exact details, but the story goes that my grandfather shut down the operations of the dairy for a year. And for whatever reason, he did it too long or something to that effect, and he lost the grandfathering status that he had to do certain things in certain ways. And that's really what kind of began to crunch the ranch operations. So things just got harder and harder. And then we tried so many different ag models, right? So one year it was, sheep and pigs. And then there was a year where we did alfalfa. We did cheese. Instead of selling the milk for milk, we did cheese on the farm. We did cheese off the farm. The cheese off the farm wound up actually working, not in the area that we were, but some of my mother's family were able to invest in some ranches in another part of California to keep the cheese business going until actually the beginning of this year. I think my last cousin that was a dairyman finally closed his doors on Christmas Eve.
Wow.
This last year. So they finally got them all,
Wow.
But I remember there's a story that I remember. My grandfather had come up with one of the cousins had come up with some new ag model. So he goes to the feed store and he talks to the feed store owner and says, "Hey, to make this thing work, I need this chemical at about this price." And the feed store owner looks it up. He's like, yeah, I can get you that. So we go back a month later, and the feed store owner is just ducking my grandfather, right? Doesn't want to see him, doesn't want to talk to him. And my grandfather, we're there to talk to the feed store owner. And the feed store owner says, "Hey, Ernie," my grandfather's name is Ernie. So the county board of supervisors met, and they had one item on the agenda. And it was that chemical that you asked about. Which meant that they had somehow found out what he was doing, right? And they said, and the feed store owner said, "Ernie, I can't get you the chemical, not anywhere near the price that we discussed," right? And with new fees and some of the things that they were doing, it just made it more expensive to get. And then the feed store owner said, "Okay, and Ernie, the land that this store is on is worth 10 times what I make in a year, and I'm selling. I'm moving to Michigan. This is goodbye, Ernie." And that event, or some variant, there was a number of things that happened kind of in quick succession, really just was what convinced my grandfather that area was no longer going to be friendly to doing ag, and he shut the ranch shop. He just shut the ranch down, and they moved on to other ranches. But then they had a great deal of difficulty selling it for anywhere near what it was worth, because the local establishment wouldn't let us rezone in suburban lots. They wanted us to sell it as ag land when their regulations had made it impossible for there to be any profitable ag use of the land. And that dragged on basically for my whole childhood, from about the time that I was, I think, 5 or 6 years old, until we finally were able to get out from under it when I was 17 years old. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So you grew up then with this vision, kind of a dynastic vision, your grandmother connecting back millennia. Did you take it for yourself at an early age, or was that something that came to you later?
I mean, I wouldn't have expressed it in the terms that we're using now. Dynasty was not the way that my great grandmother thought about it. And again, it was more like, this is the way it was. And then there were city folk that for whatever reason didn't have land. Right. And we felt bad for them, but it very much in the house as I was growing up, this concept of multi-generational continuity was just the way things were and the way things ought to be. Right. This was the goal. This was the goal of life. And this was the good life, to have this. And, one of the things that was kind of striking to me as a young person, as we were in the process when I was 16 or 17, the state had assessed our land as though it had been granted a zoning exception. So we had been sending in this rezoning request every year. Please rezone us as suburban lots, right? And every year the county would reject it for one contrived reason or another. But then the state said, well, we're going to assess your land, instead of it being 364 ag acres, we're going to assess it as though it was 1,300 or something suburban lots, right? Which was a massive tax bill, millions of dollars. And that was the event that finally got my grandfather to get lawyers involved. And I think within 6 to 12 months, we had helped a local city incorporate, got our jurisdiction drawn around our ranch of that city, and they had rezoned us, allowing, and they'd gotten us out from under the tax bill for the years that it had been assessed. And then we were finally able to sell the land. And we got 50 cents on the dollar instead of 10 cents on the dollar, which was not great, but it was better than nothing. And it really struck me, when you're 17, you have insights, right? And maybe they're true, and maybe life is more complicated, right? I'm in my late 30s now, and I understand the vast forces that were arrayed against my grandfather keeping that land, right? But as a 17-year-old, I was like, man, if we just had those lawyers when I was 6 years old, we could have kept the ranch operations going, and maybe it could have gone a different way. And Joshua, I'll tell you, even to this day, if we could have kept the ranch operations going, I still think somewhere in my heart of hearts that, maybe it could have gone a different way. So, but that left me with this great desire to help other people not lose their inheritance, right? And also a belief that one of the key reasons why people were losing their inheritances was the lack of good legal structures and the assistance of people that could help with that. And that's the story basically of why I became an attorney.
Yeah. So you and I haven't met yet, and I don't think you know all that much of my story, but I want to ask you a question, but I'll pitch it to you though, just with a little bit of background. What I find interesting is how in our modern day, although I think historically most men throughout history have spent a lot of time thinking about their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren and what can I do in terms of a dynasty. It seems as though in our modern day, that concept is very buried. My father was in essence kind of the founder of a new dynasty, right? A new patriarch. His parents, my grandparents, were wonderful people, but they weren't people with vision trying to look out centuries into the future. But my father, at an early age, he developed a vision of what he wanted his life to look like, and he had a strong vision of his family. I'm the youngest of his 7 children. He had a strong vision of the kind of quality of relationships and the kind of children he wanted to raise, and he devoted his life to that. When I was growing up, I absorbed some of that, but he didn't articulate it to me and try to force anything of it onto me. And then as I was in college, and after college, I just got interested in the idea of getting rich. And so I got involved in financial services. And then I got involved in the early retirement arena. So back 15 years ago, the concept of early retirement and financial independence started to become very popularized. And I thought, man, this is great. I can just work and save money, and then I can quit working. And wouldn't this be amazing? And so I pursued that really heavily for a few years until I started having children. And when I started having children, I realized what a waste of time this whole lifestyle and perspective is. Like, this is the most self-centered, short-sighted thing I can imagine. And I don't envy or want to be like any of these early retirement promoters in how I want to be. And so that was when I started rethinking things, and I went back and I said, no, if I have a longer term vision, then things can change for me. And it's kind of felt like that idea of, oh, wow, this is what it's like to connect with basically everyone in history, right? This is what it's like to think like a king, to think like someone. This feels very comfortable, but it took me a while to get here. So I wonder, why did we lose this idea of multi-generational thinking in favor of very short-sighted, self-focused, me and my money and my personal happiness kind of lifestyle?
I mean, there's a million different ways to tell the story of the 20th century, right? I think that there was a lot of change in a short period of time. And then people were offered deals by governments and by kind of larger corporate structures that seemed really great, right, at first. And then once they got into it, they were kind of locked in. And they also couldn't reverse the process without it basically admitting that they had been duped, right? No one likes to admit that they've been duped. And by that point in time, many of them had already had these negative aspects, some of these negative consequences in their own personal families. I can't tell you the number of people that I've had expressed to me in the older generation that they really feel disqualified. Like they feel like which is sort of odd in a majority Christian, country that we live in, where, every church basically says, hey, there's a way back. That's kind of one of the core messages of Christianity at a low resolution, right? And maybe you have to talk to God about it, but there is a way back. But for many folks, they don't believe that. Not related to their families. They believe that they can have some kind of personal salvation in the hereafter, but they don't believe that there could be hope and healing and restoration, which is, a terrible shame, right? I think the last verse of the Old Testament, it goes something like, I'll send the spirit of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children and the children back to the fathers, lest I come strike the land with a curse. So there is some pretty, rich things in the traditional spirituality of this country that really speaks to family outcomes. But it's not taught that way, and it's not believed. And many, many, many people, and I think you see this in the wealth context too, right? The main thing that holds people back is their belief that they don't deserve wealth, right? Have you experienced that phenomenon?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's the same exact thing with family. Most of these people believe that they have done something to their wife or to their children or to someone else that means that they're now disqualified from ever having the kind of relationship from investing in other people, that they're basically disqualified from being parenting. And I really think that this is a malaise that affects our culture in just an enormous amount of ways. The mentorship deficit that we're seeing kind of in certain key generations, right? Where there's large groups of people that just don't mentor the generation that's coming up, right? And I think that's part of this same perception that they have, that they made a mistake, right? And that they don't deserve, in some sense, to be that king or that noble, or to have that dynasty. That this practice, this way of life is reserved for someone out there, and that hasn't screwed up the way they have. Now, of course, when you get into it, the people that feel that way the strongest are the most qualified people in our culture to pursue that. Right? They're the people with the highest moral character, the most to offer the younger generation, but they really have this deep sense of unworthiness, and that's I think that there's probably something related. Everything in our culture right now, everyone has a theory of how our current problems trace back to World War II, and I think that that's probably an oversimplification, right? But I don't have a better story than a lot of these people felt like they did something that disqualified them from pursuing kind of this noble calling. That's really what I spend a lot of time kind of talking to people about. One of the things that I'm rarely a lawyer these days. Most of the time I'm a consultant. Like technically I'm most of the time there's somebody else that's actually drawing up the legal documents and getting things signed and doing all that stuff, right? And what I do is I sit with the family members and say, hey, do you want to have this outcome? Do you want to have your line end with you, or do you want to do things that are within your capacity? You can afford them. You have the time, especially for these people that have had, the financial success. They've gotten out of the rat race, as certain folks used to say. Do you want this? And they all say yes, right? I think also that there is just a lack of understanding of incentives, right? So people say there's two forms of communication, right? Verbal and nonverbal. Well, I say there's three. There's verbal, there's nonverbal, and then there's financial. Okay. And one of the basic magic tricks, and you got to put your money where your mouth is. And the problem is that people already are putting their money in a certain way towards a certain direction. And one of the first things that I do when I work with clients is I sit them down and I walk them through how their incentives are structured, and I demonstrate to them that their kids are, and I'm sure at some point I'll meet some family that their kids are not doing what they're incentivized to do. But Joshua, it hasn't happened yet. Okay. Like if you've got a basic, good-hearted, non-sociopathic parent, non-sociopathic kid, right? Then kids do basically what they're incentivized to do. Okay. Except when what they're incentivized to do is evil, right? So one of the basic structures I walk people through is the standard, estate plan in America is everything equally to my children when I die, right? Now, if you analyze that as an incentive structure, what are you incentivizing your children to want?
Equality.
No. You're incentivizing them to want for you, to wish for your death.
Oh, right. Okay. Right.
Your death is the thing that triggers this benefit. Now,
Right.
Again, most kids are not going to process that consciously, but especially as the money grows, right? If it's $1 million, who cares? 5 million, 10 million, 50 million, right? At a certain point, interacting with that system is going to be a temptation to your children to wish bad things to happen to you. And if they don't want to feel that way, then they have to disengage with the system. That's why you get people saying, well, Dad, you're going to live forever. Or, hey, can we talk about this later? Or, I just really don't want to do this. People talking, well, I just can't get my kids involved. And it's like, well, the reason why you can't get your kids involved is because the incentive structure right now is incentivizing them to do something that they would regard as morally objectionable, evil even, right?
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. And, I'll just respond with an anecdote. I think your comment about deserving is earlier, I think is well taken, because we've created seemingly these new, they seem to me to be new. Now, I've only been kind of exploring some of these topics for about 2 to 3 years, so I'm a novice in this area of thinking. But as I've been exploring these topics, I've been realizing I've had to reject some ideas of my own of my own kind of just natural conceptions. And one of the things that I have really wrestled with is, do children deserve their parents' wealth or not? And clearly we could argue that on multiple sides. But I had a financial planning client a year or so ago, and I've forgotten a lot of the details. But it was, as I was thinking about this, it was a scenario in which I genuinely became deeply angry about what this wealthy patriarch had done. And what he did was he took a large business that he had built, and he had been very, very financially successful with it. And he took the business assets, he turned them, he financialized the business, and he put all of the stock, or a huge majority of the stock, into a charitable trust to be given away to other organizations. And yet he still was running the business. And I was working with a son-in-law who had married one of this patriarch's daughters, and I was working with a son-in-law, and the son-in-law has this job, but basically it's just kind of a mediocre, $200,000 a year job, and he had a little bit of stock coming his way and his daughter's way. But basically, the guy had taken this business that could have been an amazing family asset, and he'd cut it up and put it into trust for charity. And yet he expected everyone to continue to run this thing just for peanuts. And it was one of the times where I genuinely viscerally became angry with the patriarch. I wanted to jump out and shout at him. And I said, listen, you had the best of intentions here, but what you've guaranteed here is you've destroyed your family by not actually passing anything on of value. And instead of creating a structure in which your children and their spouses are going to step up and inherit this enormous resource and manage it, sharing the same values, you've destroyed it. And you've taken their things away, where now I'm basically coaching the son-in-law. I'm saying, why do you want to work for this guy? Like, there's nothing here for you. Just go do something else. And so I realized, I probably wouldn't have recognized that 10 years ago, because I would have just said, oh, of course we should give the money to charity.
Right. Well, somebody else's kids will manage it better than yours, because your kids are disqualified through some murky, process that we're not clear on.
Yeah, some murky thing about how we don't want them to have too much money and have it too easy because I pulled myself up by the bootstraps.
Which, one of the ways, I've worked with some legacy families that had been in it for generations and continue to be in it for generations longer, right? And that was their desire. And they had a very interesting approach to explaining the role of the family business to their kids, which was basically the blessing, the material wealth that their family enjoyed was based on, let's call it a deal with God or the universe or whatever they believed in, right? And so there were some distinct ways, and usually these are long-term strategic plays, right? They're things that benefit the business, but not in a short term. They have distinct ways of running the business, and their deal with, whatever it is that they believe runs the universe is, hey, we're going to run our business in this way, which is to our short-term disadvantage, which in a financialized world is basically to your disadvantage. Because if you ever pump your company and then get out and financialize it and get the money out, well, then you're golden, right? At least until the system crashes. But but that's what everyone wants to do. And these legacy families, they tell their kids, hey, the money, you as an individual don't necessarily deserve the inheritance, but what we want to do is invite you in to a relationship where you're continuing to fulfill that deal. Okay. And whatever the family's involved in. So there's a family and I don't know how many people we have in common as we've explored each other. We seem to have an interesting number of people in common.
Yes, I found the same thing.
There was a large family business that was in the food industry. Okay. And they had an unusual commitment to quality. Okay, they didn't use antibiotics for any of their meat. They didn't use food dyes, and this was before RFK and all the kind of modern concerns about the more recent concerns about food dyes. They didn't use food dyes in all of their food, and they had just several unusual kind of moral stances. And they were like on their third or fourth generation in. And the main shareholder, who was the second generation, actually, ironically, did not pass on the money. He did exactly that same thing, financialize it, put the money in trust, and is going to kind of divvy it out. And within 6 months of that occurring, and many, many, many people with the last name of the founding family are still in the executive leadership of this company. But within 6 months of them no longer being future owners, they had antibiotic meat in their as their meat supplier, and they had food dyes in their foods, wow, right, in their sauces.
Wow.
Because now they're no longer, and again, everyone's like, well, how could they do that for so many years? How could they have this commitment and then turn on it? I guess it wasn't real. No, it was incentivized. Okay, you got to understand the fact that we're not communists means we believe that incentives actually do what they do, right? And you just got to live with that. So as soon as these future owners are no longer future owners, they're just managers, just like anybody else with an MBA from an Ivy League school. And if they're just managers, incentivized just like everyone else, they're going to make decisions just like every other manager. And if we don't like that, then we need to address the incentive structure, right?
Right. Absolutely. I can't wait for your talk at family camp. I have a lot of questions. It seems to me, considering which way to go, let me go back to your story, right? So as you experienced this, how did you come to get involved in coaching others, and how has that related with your own vision for your own dynasty, your own kind of vision?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, so like I said, at 17, we lost our land, but we got lawyers involved in the last minute. And I just had this realization that had we had the assistance of better legal structures and just better, a better mindset about what we were doing in terms of recognizing, hey, we are a unit that's trying to interact with another larger unit, and we need to take that power imbalance seriously, right? If we had done that when I was 6 instead of when I was 16, maybe we could have kept the ranch going. So I became an attorney, right? Estate planning attorney. And that's where I started running into the mindset issues that we've been talking about earlier, right? Again, so for my family, we didn't fail because we got disunified and, things fell apart. But for the overwhelming majority of families, what's happened is we have poor incentive structures that get set up by well-meaning parents that pit the members of the family against each other, against their parents, and against the family as a whole. And because, humans reliably respond to incentives, within a very short period of time, not always within 6 months, as I said in that example earlier, but within a very short period of time, the family rips itself apart. Okay? And I realized that after I've been doing the estate planning stuff for a while, that there was still a missing mindset element, right? So, like I said, the firm that I worked with, we had some, long-term legacy clients that they had been legacy families for a very long time, and they were committed to being a legacy family for basically forever. I mean, that was the scope of their vision. They really believed that they had built something in their internal family culture that could live forever until it was killed by some outside force, right? That there was no need, they believed, for it to age and wither away, right? But for many families, and we would set up the exact same legal structures, trusts, family limited partnerships, family LLCs, all of the panoply of things. And that's, people say, well, do I need to get a better lawyer? Mostly no. You might need to get a better tax guy, but in almost every case, like a family limited partnership agreement, with the standard family limited partnership provisions, is going to have everything in that template to do what you need to do. If you understood it, if you had people that were actually willing to play the game, if you had multiple people, so there's a difference between having a corporate structure agreement and having people believe in Apple, right? People that work for Apple believe that they're working for this being, right? Almost this corporate engine that has an existence that's outside of themselves. They this doesn't happen with every corporation, but the successful ones, it does, right? The people that work for Apple, it's not the corporate fiction is not a fiction, or at least not nearly as much, right? And I realized that we had lost that. One of the key changes, because there are some key legal changes that kind of facilitated this, is the get it in writing feature, right? So before 1880, let's say, it was pretty common for everyone to have handshake agreements, and you would, if you wanted to prove up an agreement, you would go into court and people would testify, and few enough people were willing to flat out lie in that process that the system functioned, right? And then between 1880 and 1920, that older culture kind of went away, right? And you came to the point where you really do have to get everything in writing. There's also a process where we moved kind of from a common law system where the rules were much more vague and just kind of broad moral principles that were interpreted by juries to what's called codification, where now we have code sections. And the question is, did you technically comply or violate these different code sections, right? And that is a huge legal shift, because basically before that shift, if your family behaved as a legacy family for 3 generations, you owned property, you worked collectively, you treated money and assets that came into your hands as assets of the family, that had legal force, right? You could come in and testify, well, this is, yes, I have the title to this, but I basically have it in trust for my family. And that was given legal recognition in many places. There's some very interesting things that happened in Pennsylvania in the mid 18th century, or excuse me, mid 19th century, where the firstborn sons basically viewed themselves as having financial obligations to, in particular, to their sisters, as I recall, right? So this was real, okay? Now, and what that meant was that your family kind of formed, we might call it almost a natural corporation, especially after the death of the founding patriarch. If your family kind of stayed together and continued operating as a unit after the death of the founding patriarch, there was some kind of natural corporation that had formed, okay? Now, the difference is that after codification, when you can no longer have handshake deals and it's no longer enough to just proclaim, yes, I heard this person say this on his deathbed. When you have to get it in writing, you have to get the family in writing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So now it's not that it's become illegal to do these things. It's just that it's not automatic, right? It's no longer automatic. So if you want it to happen, you have to go to someone, have paperwork drawn up, and then tell people, okay, this is the legal embodiment. This is the legal person that facilitates the existence of our family. Okay. Now, again, from my experience of legacy families, most successful legacy families will basically frame the existence of the family as a natural or a spiritual thing, that either just by the nature of things, when human beings do this, there's a natural family formed that has existence. or when you come into when you make promises to God, then a family is formed, and that family kind of exists whether the state recognizes it or not, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
I don't know that that's necessary. I'm just letting you know that almost everyone that I've ever met that had a successful family, that was a very explicit part of their mental frame, that the family exists. Oh, and we should get legal representation for it, some kind of legal vehicle to own stuff in its name. And that's really the legal stuff. It's recognizing, hey, these trusts, these family limited partnerships, these family LLCs, they can be a legal vehicle, a fictional person that acts on behalf of your family, which is greater than any single member, right? And that can be how our family operates. Whereas, in times past, there was just this assumption that if you behave this way for a sufficient number of generations, then the law and the courts would just acknowledge and recognize and give honor to that arrangement. And that is very much no longer the case.
Right. That also is, I can clearly see that conflict there. And I wholeheartedly affirm that I see the family as significantly pre-existent before government. When my wife and I married, I refused to allow anybody to make those famous words, by the authority vested in me by the state of such and such, I now declare, simply because I deny any authority of government over marriage and over my family. That doesn't mean I don't have to deal with them. We did mm-hmm. go on and get a marriage license because that seems appropriate. And I know people who don't get marriage licenses. I believe that there's no reason not. We chose to get a marriage license, but I certainly do not see. I see that my sovereignty and the sovereignty of my family is much higher than government, and so I affirm that. And I can see, but I do see how, as our society has changed, so many people think that we're dealing here with something that's a matter of government identity, rather than family. So those trends are absolutely powerful.
Yeah, there's a great book by C.R. Wiley. He's a Presbyterian pastor. I think he used to live in Connecticut, and he moved somewhere else recently. So I don't recall where he's pastoring right now. But he wrote a book called Man of the House, and I believe on page 32 or 33 of Man of the House, he has this side note where he notes that the original way that corporations got legal personhood and was by analogizing themselves to those families that already existed, right? And in the modern context, we have continued to assert that corporations have legal personhood because reasons, right? We don't exactly know what they are, while denying that legal personhood and legal recognition to families,
right?
Which is, a state that is, let's say that is sort of philosophically ambivalent, right? Where how and the question that arises: how long can that scenario continue? But what I tell people is, hey, when you recognize that your family does exist, and the question is, what is the best legal vehicle to get your family recognized by our current, maybe not the greatest government, but certainly not the worst government in history, right? Then a lot of the stress about those things it becomes less important. It's more about how does your family interact with the legal structure. Once you get that legal structure, whether it's a trust or a family limited partnership, family LLC, and there's kind of some more, exotic types of things that you can do this with. Once you have that entity set up and you have a separate legal identity, a separate EIN number, how do you interact with it? How do you note to yourself that certain property belongs to the family and not to you? Right? When are you serving your family's will and not your personal desires? Because when you do that, if you're genuinely making those decisions and handling money in that way, then there are a number of beneficial tax consequences for categorizing that money. There's a number of benefits, asset protection, liability protections, and kind of general structuring benefits. But it only works if you actually treat the money as distinct from your own, which really requires a mindset shift,
Right. So I want to ask a couple of questions that are frankly, just primarily of personal interest because I have a chance to talk to you and no one else does. Anyone who wants to listen in can do this. One of the themes that I have pursued. So when I got interested in this stuff a number of years ago, I decided, well, one of the ways that I'm going to exercise my family's sovereignty is to make it possible that we be able to divorce any particular nation state that may exist. So I'm going to create a supranational family. And that was one of the things that caused me to go offshore, to start developing multiple citizenships. I realized that since my wife and I are Americans, I realized that having done estate planning and financial planning in an American context, I realized that as long as we are living exclusively in an American context, then all of whatever family wealth we build will be entirely subjected to the laws, the taxation, things like that of the United States. But if I build a supranational family, then, and some of my children may be American citizens, some may not, things like that, then our asset base could be worldwide, and perhaps that would be helpful in the future. Now, as I have done that, I have realized that kind of strategy and thinking can have many advantages, but I think it is often oversold, and it's not necessary, and it's quite difficult to do that kind of planning. So I've kind of, I'm a big fan of the Rothschild dynasty as kind of an inspirational example. Like Meyer Amschel Rothschild, here he has 10 children that survive. His wife was amazing, had many more than that. We had 10 children survived, 5 sons and 5 daughters. And basically his 5 sons wind up going across 5 different major capitals. And, they wind up building this very, very strong family identity where they're working together, but they're kind of sprinkled around the world. And as I've thought about it, okay, if I have 5 sons, I want my 5 sons to go out and to maintain their identity within a family, but to be impactful in various spheres of the world, perhaps on various continents, various cities. And so I've gone hardcore on this international stuff with citizenships and languages and things like that. And yet I'm trying to keep a family identity. What I've observed, though, is that I don't know if, and my children are young, but the question that I think a lot about is maybe it's not possible to do that without losing the sense of family identity. If I, send my children all around the world, how do we kind of maintain that strong family home identity? And I think the Rothschilds, right, they were profoundly Jewish. They even had their own family code. They wrote German with Hebrew characters in their letters one to another. So they had like this secret code that their family, that the brothers communicated in, so their messages could be secret within the family. So of course, they have done it. But but I'm not sure that the international stuff is as good as I thought it was kind of 5 years ago. So I toss you kind of an open-ended question. How much of this do you think depends on any particular nation state, United States of America in particular, or versus global thinking? How do you consider those various questions and issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you go look at the Moravian, did you know that the Moravians didn't plant churches; they planted cities?
I want to visit those cities. I have a list of them. I want to go see the one in, is it Pennsylvania in the United States? I've never been there. I didn't know much about the Moravians until like 6 months ago. I started learning about them.
Yeah, wonderful. So you're familiar with the basic idea. I think that you should build a home base, a family seat in one particular place. And then when you have enough leaders, right, where and it's funny because you have to kind of identify, okay, we now have enough leaders that if we keep them all here, there's going to be conflict. That's actually an opportunity for you to send out not an individual, but a whole group of people. And I think, well, there's 2 things that are going on with the Rothschilds. One is it's hard to overstate the level of external pressure that there was on the Rothschilds to keep them kind of from the outside culture. There was an extremely unfriendly outside culture, and there was enough, one of the reasons why this happened at the time that it did, rather than in earlier ages, was that there was enough of these new ideas of race that basically, even if they had converted to Christianity, for instance, they would not have enjoyed the status changes that Jews who had converted to Christianity, a century or two earlier would have enjoyed. So they were stuck in this position where the only thing they had was family, right? And which does not to discount the incredible accomplishments that they had. But I think in our context in America in 2025, what we have to deal with is we're dealing with Brave New World rather than 1984. Right. So what we have to deal with is a constant assault of seduction against our children, of cheap, short-term thinking, shortcuts. Just come over here and it'll all be better, right? Sell your soul, sell your birthright for a good time. There's some amazing things happening politically right now, things that people said couldn't happen or would never happen. And so who knows, maybe in 10 years, the pressure on certain people groups will be so extreme and so kind of long lasting, right, that there will be no ability to convert from conservative to liberal, right? And then you could more easily pursue that strategy. But so we don't have pressure, right? We're not at the bottom of the sea. We're in space where there's this void that's trying to pull us apart. So I think that the right way to build a family seat in one nation and then send out a group, of essentially with the desire to plant a community or join a community and have a substantial impact, maybe take over, if I'm able to use this word on your podcast, perhaps to colonize another community with your family's ideas and to really try to bring a benefit. That's kind of what I'm going to be talking about at the family camp is, what does it look like to say, hey, we're a pillar and we can, bring stability to these small communities and benefit greatly from the exchange, right? So they benefit from a digital nomad and their community coming, and then the digital nomads really do benefit from that, the stability of that community. Okay, just kind of that's a little ad for my talk.
Absolutely.
So that's what I would say is the first step before you can. The problem is that many people who try to do the international thing too early wind up building kind of on credit, right? You don't actually have enough high functioning adults. So for instance, I wouldn't ever send someone out until the number of adults that are in their family that are used to working in a family system, right? Which is they have gotten accustomed to the idea of having certain assets in their life, certain accounts in their life that they have access to, that they have operational control over, but that don't belong to them and that need to be treated with the respect given to the family. Until you have, 30 or 40 adults that have demonstrated a period of time being able to interact with those systems without getting tripped up, that is when I would say, okay, let's take half of those adults or a third of those adults and plant a new colony in some other country. And that's where I think you get success. So it's a valid strategy. It's just, I think a lot of times people, if you send individuals over, then you're asking them to build a new family culture. And that new family culture almost certainly will not be as integratable in your broader family culture. Again, unless you're in a circumstance where you have some non-convertible identity that is going to cause the external culture to hammer you, right? Then it's possible. And thank God, that we're not in that moment right now. I'd far rather be in our context, and frankly, in modern liberal democracies, than to be in a Jewish ghetto in Vienna, right? In the 1600s. So again, I want to say I think that what they accomplished, what the Rothschild family accomplished, is amazing. But we are facing kind of the inverse of the problem that they faced. Right? We have to build something that has internal strength strong enough to not be pulled apart by a void, an anti-pressure right?
Right.
That's all around us. And they were kind of at the bottom of the ocean, and they had to build something that was strong enough to not be crushed.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think that's an apt analogy. It's interesting. I pay a lot of attention to kind of religious trends and listening to people's religious experiences. And one of the experiences I had, I was homeschooled up through middle school, and then I went to a private Christian school. And I've watched, because my wife and I, we homeschool our children, and I've watched a lot of the religious debates around homeschooling. And one of the things that I observed going to a kind of a standard private Christian school was how easy it was, and how many of my peers that were in that generically Christian environment, how quickly and easily they apostatized outside of Christianity. Many of them went on to deconstruct and go on their way. And I'm not certain that I don't know if I don't know if Christians, I don't know what percentage of students that attend Christian schools continue to profess Christian faith as compared to other places, other kinds of structures. I haven't seen any data on that. But what I've observed is that I've had friends who were Christians in government schools. And one of the things that I've heard people say, I don't think this represents the trend. It's just an anecdote, but they said, listen, y'all grew up in a Christian environment thinking that, the secular environment is better. I've been in the secular environment. I never had any illusions about it. Could have done whatever I wanted, and I realized how stupid and broken that whole culture was. So all of a sudden, the Christian culture that was much, much stronger was much more appealing, because I was raised in the horrifying reality of that nightmare, that I didn't have this illusion that somehow, if I just deconstruct from my faith, then everything will be better. It's like I already grew up living that. And so when you think about the Rothschilds or many other people, you see this even in fertility statistics, that it seems to be, I have a little confusion on recent data, but what I've heard that I think is true is that a group of people that is in a very homogenous culture basically loses any sense of competition, of intergroup competition. And so birth rates go down. Whereas if you have a minority culture that has a stronghold within an opposing or competing culture, then that minority culture they're not alone, but they're a small culture, then that intergroup competition seems to have some impact on maintaining higher fertility rates. And so it seems to be that as humans, realizing that we're in a competition of some degree of our ideas and our culture and our family and our identity with others seems to be a really healthy thing to nurture.
Yeah, well, and again, I don't think it necessarily needs to be a competition between groups. I think it just has to be a sense of mission, right? And a sense of a one of the things, I heard this. I don't speak Hebrew, so I'm relying on other people who tell me things, right? But I'm informed that the native tense in Hebrew is present perfect, right? Which means, so if a king is riding by and he tells a soldier, guard this gate, the natural tense that he would say that in is guard this gate forever and ever unto the ending of the world, right? So in English, we would say guard this gate, and there's this assumption that there's this kind of cutoff time period at the end of the person's life, if not. But I'm told that in Hebrew, it's the opposite of that. The default tense is guard this gate, and that means forever, which it means included in that job is this assumption of you need to get married, you need to train up a replacement, you need to be the person that makes a certain thing happen. And so you do have to have a family mission. So think of family missions can be like the classical family mission that we think of is the noble house with a patch of dirt, right? And they're trying, or a farmer with a patch of dirt, and they're trying to exercise the dominion mandate or the cultural mandate there. They're trying to cultivate the earth and produce lots of good there, right? But it can be, in our modern culture, it can be a certain idea. I mean, for the Rothschilds, it was a certain idea of how banking operations should be conducted. Okay, and that story, there's a lot of people that have frustration with the Rothschild family, with banking in general. That story is what key ingredient as to why the West beat the Muslim empires that had been, tormenting them for 1,000 years almost at that point. Right. They invented new technologies, new finance technologies that facilitated the greatest economic boom in the history of humanity, to the point where Christendom, the Eastern, the European countries, outperformed the Muslim world economically by like 100-1 by the 18th century, right? And that's really the story of how that clash of civilizations ended. It wasn't, with all due respect to the Crusade bros, and I'm not saying there aren't lessons to be learned from the faithfulness and the courage of those men, but the Crusades did not change anything. Like 200, 400 years of war, depending on who you ask. And at the end of it, there's this massive Muslim army at the gates of Vienna again, right? Because the Crusades did not fix the problem. But what fixed the problem was, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, and a brand new banking system spearheaded by a couple of Jewish families that allowed the Western world to finance, a massive expansion to the point where they could just economically outcompete the Muslim world. I mean, England alone outcompeted almost the entire Muslim world by the mid 18th century, is my understanding. So you have that reality. If you have that mission, it doesn't have to be a competition between groups. It can be a competition with nature, right? It can be, well, let's Elon Musk's one of his kind of missions is to get our society to be a type 1 civilization. Are you familiar with the idea of energy usage and type 1 civilizations, type 2 civilizations, these kinds of things? Have you ever heard that terminology before?
That terminology is new to me, but keep going.
Yeah. So basically, we're like a type 0.7 or 0.8. We haven't quite implemented the technology. This is about energy usage per household or per capita, basically.
Okay.
How much energy is available to do work versus how much we have to do work by ourselves as humans. Right. And Elon Musk has this goal that says, hey, we want to increase the amount of energy that we're accessing and using so that, people's lives can be better. And one of the realities, and I'm sorry to all the environmentalists out there, but every material improvement in quality of life that we've ever had, and every material improvement in our ability to conserve and protect nature has been accompanied by a 10x increase in energy usage per household. That's just a fact of history. People really, really don't like that. But you can't get away from the idea that the best way to improve human life and to increase our ability to protect the nature that we now have increasing control over is to increase the amount of energy that's available for, you might say, ordinary people or ordinary householders, right? And that's a mission that doesn't require you to see it as a struggle between groups of humans. Right? In theory, you could recruit every single human into that mission, and we all need to work really hard to get there. Right? And if there's a natal element in that mission, then I think that is successful, because you have to have what you have to have is people within that structure, kind of the middle managers, right, of the society, the people with money. They have to be willing to incentivize pronatal behavior, right? And that has just not happened. There, this is another piece of this story. So, and one of the things we faced these problems before. So, Germany around the time of the Reformation was going through a fertility crisis. One of the things that was associated with was they didn't culturally want young men to get married until they had their own established business. Well, Germany goes through some kind of economic hard times, and now it's basically impractical for a young man to have, quote, his own established business before he's 35. Well, this causes some problems because men and young men and women generally do not wait to have their first sexual encounter until they're 35. Of
course.
I know this may shock some of your listeners, but that is a very reliable feature of human nature.
Right.
So what the Germans did was they would get these kids betrothed. Then they would put the girl in a ground floor apartment with big windows on the outside, and the windows open from both sides. And that balcony, they called it a fenster, and they called this practice fenstering, because the boy would come in after dark over the balcony, sleep with the girl, right, and leave before dawn. Yeah. Well, the Reformation happens, and you got a lot of religious fervor, and this is somehow they had kind of squared that with the Catholic priests of the day, right? religious revival happens, and now you've got hellfire and brimstone preachers. This is fornication, right? This is bad. You got to stop it. And then their response was, well, what do we do? How can we get them married? And the answer of the reformers kind of broadly was, well, you just pay the boys more. You just recruit them as part of your household, and you take care of your extended family. And there's some very interesting, points about how like that is the culture. It was one of those extended families that went through a great deal of hardship, but the extended family stepped up and took care of their own. That produced, Johann Sebastian Bach, right? The great composer.
Right.
He was able to do what he was able to do because he had a lot of personal tragedy that didn't mean he starved as an 8-year-old child orphan, right?
Right.
So he went through the tragedy necessary to have artistic greatness, but his extended family stepped in and took care of him and was able to even nurture his genius. He wasn't treated basically as a slave because his parents had died. So this practice of having the family or what became the corporation step in and financially incentivize, it continued all the way. Up until the 40s and 50s, corporations would give a marriage bonus to a guy that got married, and it was generally about the same amount as a down payment on a house, right? And then they would give him a first child bonus when he had a first child, right? That was supposed to, again, be enough money injected in to allow you to change your house so that you could facilitate having a baby, okay? Because there's a necessary financial component to these things. And sadly, this is just yet another thing that's a victim of the Civil Rights Act, right? You could not discriminate on the basis of, you couldn't give somebody a bonus for getting married or having a child. That was discrimination on the basis of marriage or discrimination on the basis of parental status. Though many managers continued to pay something like those bonuses, into the 60s and early 70s. By the 70s, that practice had kind of gotten ground out by, basically discrimination lawsuits. But when you lose that, you lose the ability of people to make those decisions, right?
Yeah.
So I think, and we don't seem to recognize that there was grease being applied to the system, grease in the form of relatively large transfers of money to younger people who in no way economically deserve that. Does that make sense?
Right.
Like the quality of their labor did not go through some magical upgrade when they got married. Okay. They got married, and the corporation, acting kind of as a pseudo family, did what the other families, the legacy families, and part of the story is kind of the corporations taking over, occupying the space that these larger families once occupied. While there were still larger families in the mix, the corporations kind of had to compete with them, right? And as soon as we basically wiped out the multi-generational families, then the corporations could do whatever they wanted, and pension plans went away, and all, kind of the modern march against wage depression kind of happened. Those I can't prove a causality there, but they're linked in time, let's say.
I never knew any of what you're talking about. That's the first time I've heard of some of these connections that you're drawing, and that's extremely interesting to me. And the point that you make about this is money that is being bestowed on you that is of which you are undeserving, is such a powerful point. And there's a lot of philosophy that I think we have to discuss, especially in the American context, because things have changed so quickly. So I remember, my parents.
Well, I would push back on what do we mean by deserving? Like, what we mean by deserving is economic product per working hour. Right. If what we mean by deserving is you are signaling to the system that you are going to commit to playing long-term virtuous games, well, maybe deserving is exactly the right word.
Right.
That
I agree with that. Like that makes sense. I understand the point you're making.
But I agree with you. In the normal sense of deserving, if just standard how people say, well, they don't deserve that money. Which in pure, raw economic output terms, they certainly don't.
Right.
But,
for the good of society.
We're having this
for
crisis.
the good of society.
Yeah, well, we're having this crisis because we have decided, we capitalists, right, have decided, oh, well, we don't have to incentivize marriage and childbirth. Those things just sort of happen off an altruism space. It's like, oh, so you're a communist when it comes to birth rates. You think that people will just continue having children without any incentives whatsoever, and in fact, with increasingly profound disincentives. Just pointing out that little inconsistency.
It's true, and I can see that again the thread that you're drawing in our recent history. I observe this in our various arguments, debates, and flat out wars of ideas happening that are so easy to watch online. And the current generation of young men is entirely unmoored from. Sorry, that was too strong. A significant percentage of our current generation of young men seems quite unmoored from any coherent, overarching philosophy, but rather feels betrayed by the society that has come before. And this is creating and has created an extremely volatile society where basically it's just a matter of, well, which direction are we going to go? And we're kind of bouncing around some very challenging ideas without a sense of connectedness. And I can see their point. If you don't feel like you're a part of a family or a cultural family that is providing a pathway for you to walk and for you to take certain steps and then be looked out for by that culture, and by that family, then it basically creates the recipe for revolution, which is exceedingly dangerous. And so that's what I'm thinking of as you make your point, is that if we grant the argument you're making, there was a cultural continuity of basically this sense that we're all in this together and we're going to reward these actions that lead to a stable society. And we have supplemented that sense of stability, and now we are reaping constant instability due to the total financialization of all transactions.
Well, and the only thing that I would add to that is you begin with young men do not feel, and I would just add to that, and they feel that way because they are not incentivized to feel any other way. Right? There is no material incentive structure that is sufficient to allow them. They're basically told an unending stream of let them eat cake, because they're being told to play games that they have not been given the necessary resources to play. And again, there's this strong counterpoint from a certain portion of the population that says, well, you should pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And that's you have to account for the fact that you too were given advantages that you did not deserve at the time. Absolutely. By other people. And if you don't, then you really will be remembered. I think there are going to be people who are remembered for I think that Go Work at Panda Express will, and other things to that effect, probably not that particular statement, but the other things similar to that, if that keeps being said, if that sentiment keeps being expressed, it will be remembered in the same context as we'll let them eat cake.
Right. I agree.
And that's just a dumb thing to do, right? Especially when at scale, like food and housing and some of these things are very, very hard for individuals to afford right now. Mm-hmm. But at scale, if you have a family that has enough members to act as a firm, in many ways, I would say it's never been cheaper, right? Once you get the economies of 10 to 20 adults, it's amazingly easier to establish a family seat now than it ever has been in human history. But we have to learn how to play the game as a firm, as a family, as a unit, as a household, you might say, rather than sending people out as individuals and expecting them to get materially different results than every other individual in the system.
Yeah. All right. We're going to have a lot to talk about at camp. I want to broach one final subject that is a little bit esoteric, but it's something that I'm super interested in, and I've found very few people who can inform me on it, and I think you might be one. So I didn't warn you about this. I want to talk about primogeniture. And I would like to
Yes.
hear your perspective on primogeniture. And so you go ahead and define it, and then let me do it. Let me do it. So the definition for anyone who is this word is new to, primogeniture in this context refers to the right of succession, all passing to the firstborn child. So there is a system of primogeniture where, let's say that you have 5 children. Instead of your wealth and your estates being divided 5 ways, all of the wealth is passed to simply the oldest. And where, as I understand it, I'm not an expert in this, but as I understand it, this was extremely common in the English heritage, where, unlike, say, other continental cultures or Asian cultures, where if a father had 10 acres of land and he had 5 sons, he would give each son 2 acres. And that's why if you look in Asia or you look in many parts of the continent, in Latin cultures, you'll see that the family farms are all very narrow strips. They've been divided many, many times. Whereas the English said, no, we're going to give everything to the firstborn. He's going to be the one who has the responsibility of carrying on the family legacy, and then the younger 4 are going to be all sent off to seek their fortune. They're basically disinherited, and so they have to go out and conquer the world in some way. And I find this really fascinating because if this was a part of the English tradition that had an impact on English culture, it seems like an argument could be made that this was a pretty good system. But it seems also, because it encouraged that idea of you're not going to get anything, so you have to go off and seek your fortune. But there seem also a whole list of things that are wrong with it. So, Gregory, what do you think about the system of primogeniture with a fair glance at history, but also understanding it in a modern context?
Yeah, I think there's kind of 3 initial points that I would make on the definition of primogeniture. The first one is that it in many cultures it was not all property, right? It was usually some core unit of lands, right, that needed to stay together to be a self-sufficient economic unit. But in many cultures, so for instance, in the Old Testament, the eldest son receives a double portion, right, which is not necessarily all of it. And there was still quite a bit of continuity that was produced by primogeniture systems where it was a preference to the oldest son, not an absolute disinheritance of the younger sons. But there was a strong preference for keeping lands together. One of the things I will say, though, is just in general on inheritance laws, and including some level of primogeniture, is if you look at the Dutch, okay, when the Dutch broke off and became their own country, they had they were the first nation to try to have the modern system of inheritance, which is that you can disinherit your children for any reason or no reason, and you can have absolute, discretion in your distribution pattern. Okay, and that was happening in the Dutch context, and it was causing them problems, right? They were having problems with the food supply. They were having just a number of things that they didn't like about how farms were not surviving. So they got together and they asked their theologians, "Oh, theologians, what shall we do?" And the theologians came back with a inheritance system that said you cannot disinherit your children without reason, and you basically have to give an elder son, a firstborn son, preference, with the idea that this is going to keep farms together so that they can continue producing. Okay, it didn't mean that you wholly disinherit the younger sons, but it meant that there was an established chain, and you had to have a good reason for deviating from that. You had to have cause, right? So one of the problems that we have in the modern context before no-fault divorce was no-fault disinheritance. Okay, and I would argue actually that the long-term consequences to our society of no-fault disinheritance have been more destructive and more long-lasting in their consequences than no-fault divorce even.
Really?
Okay? Yes.
That is a shocking statement to me. That's amazing.
In the Dutch context, within 50 years of stabilizing their inheritance laws, the Dutch had the best food supply, food quality, and food availability of anyone in Europe. They had the tallest people, and they had the longest lifespan, I think, or something. There was some other, I can't remember if it was lifespan or some other quality of life indicator. And that has been true forever. It is still true to this day. Okay. Now, the recent changes that they're basically just stripping, like the EU is just stripping all farmers of their lands right now. That's kind of what's happening in Europe. Right. So if that happens, obviously the system is going to crash. But stabilizing inheritance is a really powerful mechanic. Okay. And kind of the third and final point is this is one of the critical things that a family does is it safeguards inheritance, and it sets up the rules for what does it mean to qualify as an heir. And you start qualifying, right? If you're educated by the family, if we're gonna give a default assumption that you're gonna be qualified. So you can't just disinherit your children for no reason, but in fact, the family is going to say you have to disinherit them for certain reasons. Okay, that's basically what a family trust system is. Family trust is not about trying to control people in terms of their personality or their lives. A family trust is saying, hey, in order to manage this property well, you have to be qualified, right? To use kind of a fantasy example, if we're going to give you, the fiefdom that borders the land of giants, well, you probably should be able to fight giants before you take over that one. If we're going to give you the fiefdom where you got to fight sea monsters, you might want to learn how to swim first, right? And recognizing that these inheritances come with responsibility. So one of the things that I would say, and again, this goes back to this existed in some form in our laws, or not in our laws. It wasn't in our laws. That was the point. But in a cultural context that was then given effect frequently by courts. Again, especially in Pennsylvania, that this oldest son who was receiving the bulk of the landed property he did not take that free and clear. He took it with responsibilities. So when we say, well, the firstborn son gets everything and then the rest of the kids have to go out, it's the rest of the kids have to go out if they don't want to work with their brother, right?
Right.
But if they can figure out a way to be to have a beneficial life, and they're trustworthy and reliable and loving, frequently they would just stick around for the rest of their lives. There's many, many, many cases of people who aren't the noble, at least until their older brother dies, but they're in the estate. They have a job. They perform a function. They're not layabouts. You can't linger. You can't be around and do nothing. You're going to get driven out. But it's not just that you're required to leave, right? In fact, in some respects, that was not the attitude that the nobles had. They really did want their family, just as we do. They wanted their family to stay together, and in many cases, it was the requirements of larger government structures that took their kids away, right? And what they did in England, for instance, was I would frame that discussion of the younger kids being sent out and the older child being retained as the families said to the government, if you take away our oldest sons, we will revolt right here and right now, and you will have to kill all of us. And the government said, oh, okay, well, you'll have the privilege to keep your oldest son, and the crown can't take him. But the rest of the sons, we get to take. And that would be, I think, how I would frame specifically the English context as to why some of those protections around the oldest son were originally enacted. Does that make sense?
It does. This is amazing. Well, Gregory, I'm so glad that we got connected. I have a feeling I'm going to get zero sleep during family camp. Last year in our inaugural event, there was campfire groupings going till around 2 or 3 in the morning, and I have a feeling that I'm going to be pumping you for some of these ideas for as late as you'll let me, because this is just so interesting, and it just seems like this topic that we're discussing and these ideas. I'm not. Other than a few narrow Substacks that I've been able to find, and kind of some very niche internet communities, it just seems
shout out to Johann Kurtz.
Yeah, absolutely. Johann Kurtz has a Substack called Becoming Noble, and I subscribe to his. I am super excited. I'm going to do a podcast soon on some of his ideas about meritocracy, because I realized in his writings on meritocracy that I just swallowed without any critical analysis completely the idea of meritocracy being the obvious superior like system. And now over the last months, I've realized that that's just not obviously true. And so I've been thinking hard on his points about meritocracy, and I'm really looking forward to his book that's coming out on that. But we can't go into that right now. So, but I just want to say though, is like even back to the point is there's just some small groups, and yet when I talk about these issues, it seems like we're all recognizing the need for this discussion. And I observe even just the last comment I want to make, and then pitch you up for any closing comments you want to make here. But the last comment I want to make is what you're talking about. I was thinking about the desire for like personal autonomy as compared to a sense of duty. Now, the whole thrust of our shared American culture over the last decades has been this violent progression towards absolute personal autonomy and freedom. And we see that in different spheres. So we see that with regard to sexual ethics and lifestyles and things like that. But where I recently realized, or not over the last few years, I've realized that I never pursued personal autonomy as a moralistic good from the perspective of like sexual ethics or anything like that. But what I realized was that I uncritically adopted that idea with regard to my own pursuit of personal freedom in finances and in my business life. I remember when I was 15 years old, I read one of my first like Get Rich and Make Money Online ebooks that I bought some random PDF, browsing around on the internet. And I had the idea of making money online. And that was something that there was a vision that really was there in my heart for many years. It took me 15 years to do it till I could figure out how to make a living from a laptop. And I experienced this like highest form of freedom that I could imagine. And in the beginning, it was all I saw was the good about it. Look, I can travel the world. I can live anywhere. I can make money anywhere. And look, isn't this so great? Isn't this free? But as my children have gotten older, for about the last 3 or 4 years, anytime I'm in conversation with somebody, I say, like, this is too much freedom. Like, I don't know how to handle this because it's overwhelming to literally be able to live anywhere in the world. And most people live where they live. They do what they do because that's where they're from, that's where their family is, or that's where they have a job. And today, right, while I appreciate some of the positive things about my very free lifestyle, I've repented of my kind of thirst for that freedom. And basically, I don't believe that I as a man can...
Excuse me. I think that yeah.
I'll just finish real quick. Sorry.
Agree more.
I can't handle it. The world is too big. And so I find myself in this position where I want to not be so autonomous because the responsibility is too big. So I think back to this family idea, and I think, like, I don't want my children to have this like highly tuned sense of personal autonomy. You have no obligations. You're totally free. You go out and you do everything, because I've experienced what that's like, and it's a very lonely thing. Even though I achieved all my goals, it's a very lonely thing, and I'm pursuing various changes to basically backtrack on that, to create more connections with others, because I've realized how difficult that is. And so I see that I'm not the only one, that we've done this unintentionally. We've created such a hyper individualized culture where you have to go do it all yourself, and you get to go do it all yourself, and you're 18 years old and you're kicking you out, and no, you can't work for the family business, and I'm giving everything away, and here's some money when I die, and blah, 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 that it's causing many people to experience these same emotions that I've experienced, but they're experiencing them not as a mature man like me, who is able to say, okay, I need to backtrack and adjust, and I can do that, but rather they're experiencing them in a place of immaturity. And so then they're looking for community and a sense of connection because they're unmoored from their family, which should be the cornerstone. So I think that these topics that we're discussing are so fundamental to our current moment. And I can even just see in my own life, even though I achieved all my goals, when I got to the end of the rainbow and started going through the gold, I realized, you know what, this gold is not as pure as I thought it was. It's mixed in with some disadvantages that I never anticipated. So I leave the platform open to you. Any final closing thoughts you have on this or any other themes to kind of round out our show for today?
Yeah, I think what I would say, when I'm talking about tax strategies with clients, and I say we're looking for the obligations that you have in the real world, right? Which is not the world of money. One of the things is if your family is real, right? If with a good analogy for what we're talking about when we talk about inheritances is giving one of your kids the fiefdom that's right next to the giants and one of your kids the fiefdom that's right next to the sea monsters. That means that the giants and the sea monsters are real, right? We're not inventing, or you shouldn't be, trying to invent some hypothetical obligation that you can use as an offset for tax purposes. What you want is to recognize the very real obligations that you have, not just as an individual, but as a member of a family, as the son of a father, as the father of children, right? Those obligations are real in the eyes of God, again, or whatever you believe in. And if those obligations are real, the question is not, there's no magical opt-out procedure that says, well, I can say my children won't have to fulfill those obligations by not giving them any money or by cutting them off from the resources of the family. Your children will face giants and sea monsters and dragons of all kinds. The question is, will they face it alone, cut off from any tradition, unprepared, without any sense of mission, just kind of wandering through life, not knowing why certain groups and certain things, seem to attack them for no reason? Or could they face those same challenges, those very real challenges, as the member of a tight-knit group of people that love each other, that encourage each other, and that have shared resources both between the members of a generation and intergenerationally to face these enormous challenges that they will face? And not just because, their parents ticked off every demon in hell doing some good thing, though that is true as well, but also to face the enormous things that we have to face as we move forward, right? How do we get to the point where we can actually tackle the big picture challenges that we have as a society and a world? Well, it's by having families, by having groups of people that have whole lives, that are not tormented every night when they go home because they go home to an empty apartment and they have no wife and no kids. And they're like, is anything meaningful? And some ridiculous percentage of C-suite executives blow their brains out, right, at a certain point. Instead, we want them to face that as a part of a family that has honor and that gives love, and that can be an experience that's not just acceptable, but glorious. The kind of thing that people who don't have those families would want to join. And that's really the option, right? And so I think that there's an enormous opportunity here for the best kind of life that you can imagine. So that's kind of my final comment. Amen.
Thank you for being here today. Please take a moment, share with my audience your contact information, products, services, that some about your consulting work, any services that you have that may be able to serve my audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'll start with my website, avalloncircle.com. You feel free to go on there. There are other podcasts on there where I talk about kind of in more depth some of the tax strategies and some of the consulting packages that I work with people. But really, most of what I do for clients is I work with individual family owners and helping them take their families from kind of a disconnected collection of individuals into a unified household. And I consult on a monthly basis for families like that. But all that information is on my website, avalloncircle.com.
Mr. Treat, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you very soon in Indiana.
Wonderful. Take care, sir.